So, in today's presentation, we will be talking about personality research methods. Last week, I introduced the idea and the concept of what is personality and understanding personality to the six potential lenses. However, let's take a step back to see what is even used when it comes to assessing and understanding personality. And this actually brings us to the topic of research methods. What comes to mind when you think of method? And what do you understand by the word research method? So, in short, method is a particular form of procedure for accomplishing or approaching something, especially a systematic or established one. In other words, method is a means by which a goal can be achieved. So when we say the word research method, we are achieving the goal of understanding personality through research, through using procedures that are connected to research. So research procedures or research method are used to explore and understand personality. In today's presentation, the outline will be we will first talk about what is science. Then we will go into the hypothesis testing approach. We'll go a little bit more into the case study method in particular. We'll do a brief presentation on what statistical analysis of data is and personality assessment, and then the presentation will end with a summary. So before we even ask the question of how personality is scientifically explored, we have to ask the question, what is science? Let's start from the bare bones, from the basics. So science, put simply, is an exploration. If you think about it, the world we live in can be divided into a subjective and objective world. The subjective world is the world we perceive through our senses, and therefore it's subjective, it's personal to you. However, scholars over time have discovered that there is a world that is beyond our minds, beyond our own perceptions of reality. And this world is something that can be organized in some way. It's not completely chaotic. In principle, it is possible for us to describe and understand this world in a collective manner. And so we come up with ideas to represent the phenomena that we see, that we observe, and then search for proof to sort of come to conclusions and provide evidence for this phenomena. And so that's the bare bones of what science is. Science is an exploration, and it is an exploration of the objective world using certain rules that we have created to make sense of the world in a collective manner. So science has what we know as it follows what we know as the scientific methodology. And there are 6 characteristics of the scientific methodology, which are primarily and mainly these 6. Characteristics of the scientific methodology is that it is empirical in nature, which means that you have to directly observe the phenomena that you're testing. So that's why it has to be empirical. It has to be objective, so it's fact-based. It's not based on your wishes, your beliefs, your desires. It has an objective component, as I just shared. It's systematic. It has to be carefully planned, because even within the chaos that seems to come at us at first, there is order within the world we live in. And so we need to find a systematic way to even approach and carefully study this order. The 4th is that it's measurable, which means it's reliable, valid, and relevant. And these are terms that we will describe soon in this presentation. And the 5th is it's replicable, which means science, if you completed a scientific investigation and someone else used the same conditions and replicated it, they redid the same study, it would most likely present the same results. That's the nature of the scientific methodology. It has to be replicable. And last, it's provisional, which means it's open to question and debate. For example, you must have seen a lot of studies that come out and say, well, butter is healthy for you, and butter is like, it doesn't make you fat, it's good for your health. And then you have more studies coming up saying, no, no, butter is so bad for you. So this was actually the case when margarine came out, and everyone was like, oh, that's good for you. That's not at all good for you after it was supposed to be good for you. So that is a quick example of what provisional is. That science is always exposed to theories, to ideas, to evidence and proofs that debunk previous theories and evidence, and so on. So, the characteristics of the scientific methodology, in summary, are that it has to be directly observable, in other words, empirical. It has to be fact based, in other words, objective. You have to carefully plan it to study it, in other words, systematic. And it has to be something that you can rely on, it's valid, and it's relevant to what you're looking for, which are key tenets of being measurable. And then it has to be something that you can do again and find the same findings or similar findings, which speaks to the replicable nature. And last but not the least, it's provisional. So it's not something that you're stuck with. There are new discoveries that debunk old discoveries, and that's the nature of the scientific methodology. So this brings us to the next part. What are the different types of methodology? Now that we know the characteristics of the scientific methodology, we can actually see that there are many types, and they can primarily be divided into these four. The first is something known as a case study, and we will go more into detail about this at a later point in our presentation. But a case study is something where you take one person and you study them over time to measure a specific phenomena or a specific process. And it's something that you could also do to understand personality. So let's say someone has a rare personality disorder. Let's say dissociative identity disorder, just as an example, even though that is a very rare phenomena, and we don't find it as much. And sometimes those are the cases that are best for case studies, especially when you don't have a lot of people to study it on. So you track one person with that specific disorder over time, and you see how it exhibits itself, and you gather data, and that data speaks to the information that you collect towards that disorder. So a case study method is specific to one case or a few cases, a handful of cases, let's say 2 to 5. The other type of methodology is field study, something you go out in the field and you study the people or study the phenomena as it is happening. And these can be divided into qualitative, quantitative, and mixed. Qualitative field studies are basically those field studies where you get sort of subjective reports from people. So you do interviews, you collect maybe stories of what people feel and think, and you gather that information. Quantitative is most to do with numerics. So when you go out, you collect data, it consists of the mathematical component. Now, quasi is something where you don't even touch the environment. You just measure it as it is. You don't manipulate anything, and you're gathering data as it is. So, for example, let's say you enter into a hospital setting, and there are a bunch of people in a hospital, and you want to measure their quality of life. Well, you don't interfere with anything at the hospital setting. You just do what they're doing, and you don't change or manipulate anything. You just measure how their quality of life was when they first came in, and how their quality of life is when they are discharged from the hospital. That's a quasi study. And a mixed study is one where you use both qualitative and quantitative methods. So one where you could measure the participants' behaviors or thoughts or emotions. You have those measures, but you also have the interview formats and their own subjective reports. Both of those together, the number and the, the words together, form the mixed field study approach. The last two are the systematic review and meta-analyses. So systematic review is going into the literature, all the lit review on a specific topic. Let's say you want to understand what extroversion is. So you look over all the studies that have looked at extroversion and you systematically review them, and together you put a paper about what are the patterns you found, what are some commonalities, what are some differences, what are some gaps, what are some things, some directions for future research. Though that's a systematic review. And a meta-analysis is more towards the mathematical side. So you look at the statistical part, you meta-analyze. So you look at all the analysis that has been done across the board. So let's say you look at the correlation between extroversion and friendliness. And you look at all the studies that have looked at extroversion and friendliness in different parts of the world. And now you could do a meta-analysis. You could analyze the analytics of that were done in each of those studies, and you propose your own findings based off of that. And so each of these methods has its own charm, has its own purpose, and different researchers pick which one suits them the most, or which one they most like, or which one answers their question their best before they can implement and utilize this type of methodology. So last but not the least, before we dive into understanding personality through the research methods, we have to also understand the procedure. And the nature of investigation follows a very systematic procedure. At any given time, when you want to explore a question from a scientific point of view, as a scientist yourself, the first and most important thing any scientist does is makes an observation, right? You make a certain observation. Let's say you're walking down the street and you see, I see these two different type of people. There are one type of people that are very friendly, and there are other type of people who are quite unfriendly. So my sort of observation is, are the friendly people more extroverted? Are they more comfortable when they're in outside settings, when they're outdoors? So that formulates your first question, right? You make an observation and then it brings you to asking a question. Are extroverts more friendly than introverts? And so this takes the next step any scientist does after asking a question is checking the literature. And why is this the case? Because as a budding scientist, especially if this is the field that one aspires to go into, you can't just ignore all the research that has been done so far in our field, all the progress that has been made, and start from scratch. You have to look and understand that there are 8 billion people in the world, and you might not be the first person asking that question. So you dive into the literature and you see who else has asked this question, what has been answered, and what can you find. And after that, if your question hasn't been answered, and if it doesn't do justice to what you are specifically trying to look for, then you form a hypothesis, which is in simple terms a prediction. You say, okay, so there is literature out there that extroverted people are more friendly versus introverted people. However, we don't really know if this is the case in, let's say, in urban settings versus rural settings. And so that could be like your unique sort of more specific question that comes from you. That would be sort of your add in, your contribution to the research world. And so you form a hypothesis and say, I would like to know if extroverted people are friendly in an urban setting more than a rural setting. And so Here you come up with an IV and a DV. And what an IV and DV is basically an independent variable and a dependent variable. And an independent variable is something that you can manipulate, right? So in this case, the independent variable is the urban versus rural setting. It's something that it's independent. You can't it doesn't depend on anything. You can independently um, make it be whatever you want it to be. And then the dependent variable is something that is measured and it depends on what the independent variable is. So you can see how people's extroversion and friendliness correlates in an urban versus non-urban setting. So after you have formulated and completed these stages um, of your scientific exploration, these can be very creative aspects of science, which is designing and conducting research. So you take a few participants, you launch your study, you try to see how many of these extroverts in the urban setting are more friendly versus in a rural setting, and then you collect data. You prescribe measures to collect certain variables that you want to analyze. You collect the data, you analyze, you make conclusions, and you replicate. So this is sort of the systematic way through which science proceeds. Now, before we even proceed with um, further knowledge in this area, I do want to make sure that you understand what skepticism is in the scientific world. A lot of people, especially in the area of when something controversial is being studied in the scientific field, there comes a natural skepticism, especially scientists, as their personality too. They are very critical and curious people, and so skepticism is very natural in the world of science. However, it's very important to know that skepticism, although it leads us to question things and view things with a critical eye, skepticism followed by an attitude of dismissal risks science towards the path of dogma or dogmatism. And science, remember, is not a dogma. It is an exploration. A dogma is sort of um, an axiomatic, strict type of teaching, and that's it. Period. Right? But science is exploration. So if someone is assessing or exploring something that's contentious, you have to have an open mind and investigate and look at it from an eye of openness that leads to exploration and investigation. That is the trait of a true scientist, to prove and disprove all theories, propositions, and presuppositions using innovation, good methodology, and open mindedness. Skepticism that meets itself with a critical I soon, with an attitude of dismissal, is never a good thing. So always be open and always investigate and ask questions. These are some helpful readings that I recommend. Wounds, Outlines of Psychology, some very classic readings on the scientific methodology that if you're interested, you could look into at your own time. So when it comes to personality, let's go back to focusing on personality now that we've got the nature of science, the scientific exploration, and all of those cleared, all the basic bare bones. So when it comes to personality, what are the four primary sources of data that are collected to examine personality using the scientific framework? The first is called the self-report method. So when you're trying to understand someone's personality, one of the best ways to collect data to gather intel is to help them do a self-report, which is basically a couple of questions that people take and to report their own feelings, thoughts, and behaviors. Now, the advantage of this type of resource, this type of source through which you collect personality data, is that you could collect a lot of information in very convenient ways about the person, and you know that the person is reporting it. It's simple, it's easy, it's quick. However, the disadvantage is that it's error prone and it could be biased because the person themselves is reporting it. So a person might think too highly of themselves or too um, skewed. The data here could be skewed based on what the person has to share on their own. The second type is called the informant reports, and this is this is basically data that you get from the informant. So let's say you're collecting information from participant A about their personality. Now the informant report is when you collect data from their parents, you collect data from their siblings or their friends, and so those are informants, the reports from people who inform you about your participant. Now, the advantages of this is also that you can get a lot of information. Um, how and it's a causal, so you can see that okay, the friend is saying this, and it might match with what the person is saying about themselves. However, there is lack of access to private experience, right? So now, because you're collecting data from the informants and not from the person themselves, you don't really know what the person feels themselves. And so there can be a little lack over there. The third is the data that comes from life outcomes, right? So let's say a person is depressed. You've collected subjective reports of how depressed they are. You've collected informant reports from their parents and so on about how depressed they are. Now you look at information that you look at their life outcomes to see, to sort of see how their depression is affecting them, or whether they are really depressed and what's going on as a result of that. And this, we're moving more towards the fact-based data collection. So here you're looking at, okay, this person is depressed, so their relationships recently got broken, they lost their job, and they're not able to get out of home. So all of these are life outcomes. And the good thing about collecting data on life outcomes is that it's objective and verifiable. You can you can verify it. You could be like, okay, this person just lost their job. You could verify that kind of information. And it could be psychologically relevant as well. However, the disadvantages are that it can be multi-deterministic, right? So life outcomes, they may not always be the result of what that particular person is feeling or that particular variable that you're looking at. So the person may have lost their job not because they're depressed, but because the economy is really bad, right? So that's one of the disadvantages of collecting data on merely on life outcomes. The last is behavioral observations. So you could collect data about how they're behaving, and this comes down to the objective way of looking at things. So the behavioral observations would be, okay, the person has stopped going out of the house, they're not sleeping that well, they're not eating that well, and so you collect all the behavioral data. Um, this is also very fact-based, it's objective, those are the advantages. However, the disadvantages are that it can be difficult and expensive to collect all that data. So it's very important to get information about personality from all four sources if you want to understand personality holistically. So now we enter the hypothesis testing approach. So the hypothesis testing approach is something that is a very common method we use in our scientific world. And what is basically done is we propose a theory, which are general statements about the relationship between constructs or events, right? You have a theory, which in simple terms, it's an idea, right? It's a basic idea about what you think about the event or phenomena. And the two characteristics of a good theory are that they're parsimonious and useful. So a good theory is a good theory when it can explain whatever phenomena you're trying to understand in simplistic terms. And it's also useful. It can generate testable hypotheses, right? So let's say your theory is that extroverted people are more friendly, right? And now you're sort of trying to understand that the idea of friendliness, and you're trying to explain the phenomena of friendliness, and extroversion is sort of a parsimonious um, sort of characteristic of your theory of understanding friendliness. And the usefulness is that you could test this. So you could see how many extroverts are actually friendly versus not. This brings us to hypothesis. So theory is the first step. You come up with an idea, and then the hypothesis, the prediction about that relationship, right? So my prediction would be that extroverted people are more friendly than introverted people. And that's just an example to make it simple for you to understand. And that's a prediction. A theory is unacceptable if empirical investigations consistently fail to confirm predictions. And that's why a lot of the times free scholarly material before science became very concrete and hardcore evidence-based um, is being looked at with skepticism in today's world. And we will come across this when we look at psychoanalytic work and how some staunch new modern scientific explorers are very skeptical about this field um, of understanding personality, because there are lots of theories that are yet to be empirically investigated. The hypothesis testing approach, another example would be, let's take the theory that loneliness is caused by lack of social skills. Now, the hypothesis could be that lonely people don't initiate as many conversations as non-lonely people. Lonely people have less accurate perceptions. And lonely people make more socially inappropriate statements. So any of these hypotheses sort of comes from this theory that loneliness is a lack of social skills. And so one way of testing this hypothesis could be that, let's say, lonely people make more socially inappropriate statements. So you can have judges, and in a test, you could test it. You can have judges count the number of inappropriate statements made by lonely versus non-lonely people in conversations with a stranger. And so, as I shared earlier, there is the independent and dependent variable. This is just a slide which you can read. It's pretty straightforward. And the independent variable are variables that can be manipulated. They're usually the treatment variables, and the dependent variable is one that depends on the independent variable for its own sort of characteristics, the outcome. And when it comes to personality researchers, a lot of this is tested in university settings with students and in labs. There's also something known as interaction of the experimental variables. So if you've heard of something known as the confounding variables, let's take an example here, okay? So the independent variable here in this graph is anxiety or no anxiety, right? So an anxiety condition and a no anxiety condition. And the dependent variable is how many questions are asked. So when people are in the anxiety condition, do they ask more questions, or when they are in no anxiety condition? Originally, we can see that, okay, as people become more anxious, maybe they do ask less questions, right? Because they're scared they will be judged or based on what they're anxious about. However, when we look at the third component, let's say we add the part of shyness. That's the confounding, or that's the third variable. That's the interaction effect that's created. So shy people, if a shy person is put in an anxious condition, then they will ask less questions, as you can see. If a non-shy person is put in an anxious condition, they will ask more questions. Because they're anxious, they're not shy, so they're like, I really want to know what the answer to this question is. And so that's an example of what an interaction variable is. It's like a third party that comes in and sort of influences the relationship between the independent variable and the dependent variable. So again, it's important to know that when you are administering or having independent variables in your study, make sure they're randomly assigned, because it evens out the differences. And this is sort of the same thing we spoke about earlier. You can read this at your own time. Predictions versus hindsight. Accurate predictions can be made if a scientist has a legitimate theory. Purpose of research is to provide support for a hypothesis. So, in short, researchers generate a theory, make a hypothesis, collect data that supports or opposes hypothesis, and unpredicted findings by the researchers are basis for future hypotheses and further research. And that's how our field keeps moving forward through this cycle of theory, hypothesis, testing, theory, hypothesis, testing. So, replication, it's important to see that our field is currently suffering from this. There are a lot of studies that aren't being replicated in the manner that they're supposed to be replicated. They're producing different findings each time, and so there was a replicability crisis in our field several years ago, and um, it was connected to this file drawer problem, if you've heard of it, where researchers would only publish research that showed significant effects, and so things that did not show significant effects were sort of, put in a file drawer. They were stored in a cabinet somewhere. And it was important to also look at why those weren't producing significant effects and approach that from that angle. So, failed attempt at replication makes researchers decide what has gone wrong. Is it the file drawer effect? And if so, like, how can we make one of the most important characteristics of the scientific methodology, which is replicability, have its credibility in the field? So, the case study method here is a more in-depth um, examination of what it exactly is. You can read over this slide. It's pretty straightforward. The important thing to note here is that researchers record in detail the person's history, the behavior, the changes in behavior over time, depending on what question you're asking. Data are usually descriptive, and it's an in-depth analysis. The limitations are because you just looked at the single individual, you can't generalize it, and it's important to know that it's most to do with subjective than objective, where you need more of a collective census. So when it comes to statistical analysis, why do we even do it? And what are the components? So in the world of personality research, there are three different types of personality based statistical analysis that people mostly use is the ANOVA, which is the analysis of variance, chi-square tests, and correlation coefficients. Types of statistical tests appropriate for different types of data and research designs. These are some of the important ones to assess the differences between, let's say, groups of people, between different personality types, and so on and so forth. Now, layered is a very helpful statistical training site. I highly recommend you to look over this, especially if you're students, if you're budding researchers in this field, if you're like full-time students, and you're doing some master's thesis or PhD thesis projects. It's very important to look over this site, which I personally found incredibly helpful when I was completing my thesis. It goes over all the statistical methods. Which one could you use when and how? So statistical analysis is done to basically see the difference between two averages, whether it is large enough to be considered that it is not by chance alone. There is a true difference between this observation, right? So you take a bunch of extroverted people and test them for how friendly they are in an urban and rural setting, and if they're significantly different, that means that there is a difference that you could find an extroversion in both of these settings. There is an importance when it comes to urban versus rural settings and the way extroversion exhibits itself. Now we all know what correlation is. It helps understand the relationship between two measures. It can be reduced to a single number. A positive correlation is when both variables are sort of moving in the same direction, higher or lower. A negative correlation is when they're moving in different directions. So this is a graphical example of how you can conceptualize correlation. So let's say people who are lonely are also depressed. The more lonely you are, the more depressed you are. This is a positive correlation, +1. On the other side, you will see that people who are people who are more lonely are less depressed. That's a negative correlation. And so this is a positive +1, this is a negative -1, and this means there is no correlation between these two variables. So when it comes to personality assessment, psychologists take the risk of measuring personality much more seriously. Their valid and reliable assessments is a key component of personality research. So now this brings us to the topic of reliability. This is a pretty straightforward slide. However, if you want to remember what reliability is for life, know that it's something like the scale. Every time you go and stand on the scale, you do not get sort of a different outcome every minute that you look into it. The reliability is the consistency of something, right? So something that consistently shows you that it's correct. So let's say extroverted people are more friendly. It's happening on a consistent basis. It means for sure that extroverted people are friendly. And when it comes to validity, you will see that it measures what it is supposed to measure, right? So you will see that, let's say the weighing scale, it is measuring your weight in pounds. It doesn't measure your height. And so that is an example of validity. And there are different types of validity, like face validity, where when you decide test measures, what it measures based on the components of the scale. There's congruent validity, where you see the extent to which the scores correlate with other measures on the same construct. There's discriminant validity, where you see extent to which the test scores does not correlate with the scores on unrelated measures. And these are some examples of validities. So with this, we end today's presentation. This is a quick summary of what we went through. I would highly encourage you to go over the slides, read over everything, and all the best.